this is a grinding day, right? There's a lot of um, kind of fundamental stuff that we're talking about related to the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. So the good news is that by the end of class this afternoon, my hope is that we will really have built the foundations of this model so that tomorrow we can begin to use it. And I think as we begin to use it, not only will the discussions get more interesting, but I also think that we'll get more comfortable with the model. We'll begin to kind of figure out some things about the model, right? As we get to see what this model tells us about the way that the world works, and particularly these questions about recessions, what causes them, and what you do about them, right? And so anyway, so strap on tight, right? We got about another hour or so of kind of some hard work in terms of developing the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. But as I said, by the end of class, I think we'll have done a lot of the heavy work, and so tomorrow will feel. My hope is that tomorrow will feel a lot more interesting, and probably feel a little bit better about yourself as we actually begin to use the model, and hopefully you see that you kind of understand this a little bit as we begin to use it. So to begin, let's just kind of review a little bit. I don't have time to review everything that we talked about this morning, but let's spend a little bit of time just reviewing. Let's not go back and review aggregate demand. All right, I'm fine to do that at some point, but let's talk about our short-run aggregate supply curve. Okay, and make sure that we really understand what's going on with this short-run aggregate supply curve. So once again, our short-run aggregate supply curve is upward sloping, meaning there's a positive relationship between the price level. I keep on putting Q here, sorry, force of habit. There's a positive relationship between the price level, not the price level, and real GDP. And we said that this is really the idea behind Keynesian economics. It says that really there's this complicated, or there's a positive relationship here between the price level and real output. And we talked about why. And we talked about two reasons why this happens. The first that we spent quite a bit of time talking about is the fact that we have sticky wages. So we talked about things like, that there's minimum wage contracts and other forms of labor contracts that often keep wages from falling. We talked about the idea of efficiency wages, that firms don't want to cut wages, right? So as a result, what happens like during a recession when we typically see the price level fall? What that means is that real wages go up because firms don't cut nominal wages. And so as those real wages go up, firms lay off workers. This increases unemployment, and it reduces the supply of output. Right? It reduces the supply of output. So notice, what's the relationship here between the price level and output? There's a positive relationship here. When the price level goes down, output goes down. And we could work through the opposite example. In fact, this might be a good exercise for you to try tonight when you're studying, is to see if you can kind of talk through the opposite example when the price level goes up, right? What happens when the price level goes up? Can you think about how that impacts aggregate supply? We also talked about the problem of imperfect information. I don't feel like I explained this very well this morning, so let me give it another shot. That inflation often changes the price level unexpectedly, and I should be clear here: unexpected inflation, right? If it's inflation that's expected, that won't necessarily change anything. But what if it's unexpected inflation? That will often change the price level unexpectedly, right? So what happens if, for instance, the price level falls, but nobody knows about it? And as a result, nominal wages don't change because nobody knows. What's then going to happen? Real wages really start to go up because much of the public doesn't know what's going on, and many firms don't know what's going on. And so as real wages go up, we get really the same thing. We get layoffs. That leads to an increase in unemployment and a decrease in output. We get this same positive relationship between the price level and aggregate supply. Okay. Does that make a little bit more sense? Hopefully. If not now, hopefully when you go back and look at your notes, spend a little bit more time thinking about it, right? But these are the two reasons why the short run aggregate supply curve slopes upward. Now, let's talk about things that shift aggregate supply. And we really talked about three things. One is the things that change productivity. And we know what those three big things are: physical capital, human capital, technology. Right? So, as a simple example here, what if there was a big increase in education? Right? For whatever, I don't know what exactly would drive this, but there's some big increase in the amount of education. Everybody decided as a society, we're going to spend 2 more years in education. What's that going to do? Well, that's going to increase productivity, right? What's that increase in productivity going to do to our short run aggregate supply curve? It's going to shift it in this direction. This would be an increase in short run aggregate supply. Vice versa, something that reduced productivity would reduce short run aggregate supply. We also talked about changes in commodity prices or input prices. Things like raw materials, energy prices, or importantly, wages, right? Because labor is an important part of aggregate supply, because for most goods, the biggest input is actually wages. So once again, let's think of another example. For instance, something that a big increase in real wages. What would cause this? Well, let's say that the government passes a new minimum wage law that says everybody needs to get paid 25 bucks an hour at least. Okay, so it increases the number of the increases wages for a large number of US workers. You might have seen in the news that there is currently under consideration an increase in the minimum wage law that's being talked about. However, that increase in the minimum wage law is an increase to $15 an hour, which quite honestly is not going to change much because most workers are earning more than $15 an hour. Now, a few of you who are working may not be. you guys all probably fall into the category of workers who might be affected by this. But the vast majority of workers in the US are earning more than $15 an hour. What happens if the minimum wage law was risen to 20, 25 bucks? Yeah, that's going to be a significant increase in real wages. And what would that do? So my thing is not working again. This is really so perplexing as to why sometimes, there it goes, okay. It's utterly baffling to me why sometimes this stuff works and sometimes it doesn't. I actually spent a big chunk of lunch trying to figure out why this pen doesn't work, and I've not yet been able to figure out why. Okay, so a big increase in real wages would reduce short-run aggregate supply. Which way does short-run aggregate supply shift? To the left, right to the left. This is a reduction in short-run aggregate supply. Now, there's a third thing that could shift short-run aggregate supply, and this is the one we didn't talk about this morning. Changes in expected inflation. And nominal wages. Expected inflation is one of the things that can change wages. So we just talked about how wages can shift short-run aggregate supply. Well, one of the reasons why wages change is because there's changes in expected inflation. Okay, so number 3 is really closely related to number 2. When the public thinks inflation is going to be higher or lower, then there's going to be a change. The public's going to change their nominal wages. Okay? So, let's think about an example. Let's say that the public expects inflation to be higher in the future. And as a result, workers demand higher nominal wages to compensate them for the fact that expected inflation is higher. Well, what do higher wages do? They're going to reduce short-run aggregate supply, right? Because wages are an important input into production. So higher wages is an increase in the price of an input. That's going to discourage production and shift the short-run aggregate supply curve to the left. So in other words, if we have an increase in expected inflation, we would expect the short-run aggregate supply curve to shift down. Okay. Remember this one. Remember this one, because this is going to be an important part of the story that we told tomorrow about how economies evolve over time. Because we're going to tell a story in which actual inflation differs from expected inflation in the short run, but in the long run, people adjust and they adjust their expected inflation, and that causes wages in the aggregate supply curve, the short run aggregate supply curve, to adjust. Okay? So this is, once again, kind of a part of the story that we're going to use to tell the more complicated story of what happens during a recession, and then how do economies recover after a recession, right? And so we'll come back to this fact, but for right now, the really key thing to remember here is that expected inflation is one of the things that shifts our short run aggregate supply curve. And why is that? Because it changes wages, and wages are an important input, right? An important input into production. So when expected inflation goes up, wages go up, that's an increase in the price of production, and so short run aggregate supply shifts to the left. Okay, that is our short run aggregate supply curve. But as we talked about at the beginning of class, there's also such a thing as the long run aggregate supply curve. So if you think about the short run aggregate supply curve as kind of being the Keynesian aggregate supply curve, then you should think about the long run aggregate supply curve as being the classical aggregate supply curve. What determines output in the long run? This was the key theme of chapter 9. What determines output in the long run? Anybody?
Productivity.
Productivity, which is based on three things, right? Human capital, physical capital, technology. This is the only thing that matters in the long run. That's in the long run, that this is what makes a country rich. These are the things that determine productivity, and that's what we learned in chapter 9. Does the price level matter in the long run? No, it doesn't. In the short run, there can be confusion. Wages are sticky, meaning they don't move very fast. There's confusion. People have different expected inflation rate from what inflation turns out to be, right? In the long run, there's lots of confusion, or in the short run, there can be lots of confusion. But in the long run, does the price level matter? No. And so as a result, what's true about output and the price level in the long run? There's no relationship. Instead, you are at the natural rate. You're always at the natural rate of output in the long run. And what determines the natural rate of output? These three things. Those three things are the things that determine the natural rate of output in the long run. So in other words, the price level doesn't matter in the long run. It doesn't matter. This idea that the price level doesn't matter in the long run is an idea that has a very long history in economics. In fact, this is referred to as classical money neutrality. Classical money neutrality. Classical because it's an idea associated with the classical model. And money neutrality, meaning that money and prices are neutral. They don't matter in the long run. So what classical money neutrality states is that in the long run, changes in the aggregate price level only impact nominal variables, such as inflation, nominal wages, nominal interest rates, but not real variables like unemployment or real GDP. In the long run, changes in the aggregate price level only impact nominal variables, but they don't impact real variables. What impacts real variables? Real variables impact real variables. So for instance, the amount of capital, the amount of human capital, the amount of technology we have, that matters to real GDP in the long run. The price level doesn't because it's a nominal variable. Okay, so let's make sure we understand the intuition behind this, because this is really an important idea, right? And this is an important idea not only to understanding the way that the world works, but it's going to be an important idea to understanding how economists think about things like recessions and depressions. So to get some intuition about what's going on here, let me give you a hypothetical example, right? Now, obviously, this is a crazy hypothetical example, but I think it illustrates an important point. So let's say that the Federal Reserve, who's the organization that issues money, they are going to conduct a grand experiment. And so their experiment is, next week, everybody takes their green dollar bills to their local bank. And in return, you get 2 red dollar bills. Okay? So take all your money that's green, take it to the bank, exchange it for red dollar bills, right? And if you have money in the bank, you have $1,000 in the bank, that's in green money, it becomes $2,000 in red money. Okay? So the Fed announces that they're going to do this. What would you expect to happen to the price level as a result of this? What would you think? If we just doubled the amount of money in the economy, what do you think would happen to the price level?
It would go down. Like it'd be worth less. Like a singular dollar.
The value of money would be worth less, right? So what would happen to prices? If money is worth less, then prices have to go up, right? How much would prices go up?
They would double.
It would double, right? I mean, that's kind of common sense. If the money supply doubles, we would expect the price level to double. Would that cause people to work more? Should that change the unemployment rate? Should it change the amount of education you get? Or the amount of physical capital that you accumulate? Or should it impact technology? No, it shouldn't really matter, right? It really shouldn't matter. And that's what money neutrality is saying, that when you change the money supply and you change the price level, yes, it changes nominal variables, but it's not going to change real variables, not in the long run, right? Not in the long run. If I can give you another analogy that might help, think about what happens during daylight savings time, right? What happens during daylight savings time? We move our clocks back an hour. Well, our clocks are really measuring a nominal variable, right? A clock is really a nominal quantity. So we can change our clocks back an hour, forward an hour, that's great. But what about the position of the sun? The position of the sun is a real variable. When we change our clocks, does it change the position of the sun? No, right? And it's the same when it comes to changing the price level, right? If we double the money supply and double prices, it shouldn't impact any real variables, right? Everybody's going to be just the same off. We've just taken all the numbers and multiplied by 2, right? It's not going to significantly change anything. However, I want to emphasize something really important here. What's the magic word in this definition? In the long run. In the long run, that's true. But does it have to be true in the short run? Not at all. Not at all. Like, for instance, go back to this red dollar bill example I gave you. What happens if the Fed would double the money supply and double the price level, but many people can't change their wages because they're locked into a wage contract? Now it's going to impact their real lives, right? Because prices have gone way up, but their wages are locked in. Now it's going to start to change their life, right? Likewise, what if the Fed would do this kind of on the sly? And by that I mean, in the example I talked about, I made it kind of clear what the Fed was doing by changing green dollar bills for red dollar bills. What happens if the Fed just printed up a lot more money and started putting it into the economy and didn't tell anybody? Could that start to change things? Sure, it could. If people don't know what's going on, inflation might change in unexpected ways. So, yes, money neutrality, I think, is an important idea, but it's really important to understand the caveat here. We're talking about the long run, when everybody kind of has perfect information and knows what's going on. In the short run, this is not going to be our aggregate supply curve. In the short run, where we have market imperfections and imperfect information, this is going to be our short run aggregate supply curve, right? So they're really for 2 different scenarios. What's true in the long run, when we have perfect information and markets have had a chance to work itself out, and what happens in the short run, when we are basically don't have perfect information and markets sometimes start to break down. So in the long run, according to our model, what should be true? In the long run, we should have a short run aggregate supply curve, and we have our aggregate demand curve. But in the long run, it also has to be true that we are at our long run aggregate supply curve as well. In other words, we are at their natural rate of output. And unemployment would also be at the natural rate of unemployment. Okay, so in the long run, we're going to be where output is at the natural rate, unemployment's at the natural rate. And what's the price level going to be? It's going to be that price level. We can think about this as the long run equilibrium in our economy. And when we talked about economic growth, this is essentially the model that we talked about, right? That we're kind of in our long run equilibrium. And what determines that natural rate? Productivity, right? How much physical capital we have, human capital, technology. There's also something else that's true in the long run here. It also has to be the case that actual inflation equals expected inflation. That also has to be true here in the long run. Because if this is not true, it can't really be the long run in the sense that people haven't figured out what the inflation rate is. So this also has to be true in the long run. Put this down here. Right? Those are the things that we know have to be true in the long run. That actual inflation is equal to expected inflation, that output's equal to the natural rate, that unemployment's equal to the natural rate. Okay, so let's take a break here just for a second, because now we have really put together the building blocks of the model. Okay, we've really put together the building blocks of the model. Now's really the time to think about, well, what does this tell us, right? What does this tell us about the way that the world works? But before we move on to that for a few minutes, let me just open it up for questions. Who's got some questions, or what's not clear to you? Anything jump out to you that's not clear about this model, either about short run aggregate supply, long run aggregate supply, aggregate demand, actual inflation versus expected inflation? Do we not have questions because we understand everything? Or do we not have questions because we're so confused we don't know what we understand?
Second one.
Second one, okay. I buy that. I mean, I actually buy that. Listen, nobody said this would be easy, right? Nobody said this would be easy. This is more complicated stuff, right? This is more complicated stuff than some of the stuff we've talked about in the first half of the class. So I really encourage you tonight, just as I hope you did last night. But tomorrow we're just going to finish up chapter 12. We're going to continue to work on chapter 12. So there's really no new reading if you read through chapter 12. So this would be a great night to go back over all this stuff, right? And particularly that first half of chapter 12 and really understand the mechanics of this model. So let's spend a few minutes then moving on to what this model can tell us. What does this model tell us about recessions? Why aren't we always at the natural rate? What does this model tell us about recessions? So I want to just show you that I think you already know this, but we're not always at the natural rate. Okay. Okay, is this showing up for you? It's a graph here with orange and blue lines. Is that working? Okay. Once again, it's a little clunky on my screen. So this is looking at potential output. I think your book uses the word potential output often instead of the natural rate of output. They're really the same ideas. Your book uses both of them. I tend to try to just focus on the natural rate of output, but they're really the same idea. So the orange line is looking at an estimate of what the natural rate of output is every year. But notice that actual output can be quite different than that. And when actual output falls below potential output, that is really what we as economists think of as a recession. And so you can see some recession periods here. 1990 and basically 1990. If you look at the bottom of the graph, those years that are in green are kind of essentially, well, I don't know. I don't think it's years in green. I don't know why some of those years are green, right? But take it back. But basically, you can see the recession years here. 1991 was a recession year, right? In which the US economy fell into a recession and we were below our level of potential output. 2001 was a recession year. And then you see dwarfing those two relatively small recessions is what happened in 2008 to 2009, where we had the global financial crisis. And that was a big recession. And notice here, the recession itself, right, the period of output falling was 2 years, but you can see how long it took for us to get back to potential output, right? So this data only goes to 2017. You can see where we were just getting back to potential output by the end of 2017. This doesn't have the most recent data from COVID, but what would we see if we extended this graph to recently? Once again, we'd see a big fall below potential output, right? Not as big as the fall in 2008 and 2009, thankfully. In 2008, output fell by about 10% below potential output. Last year, we fell about 7% below potential output, okay? So, not as big a fall, but we would see very much the same kind of deal. And so the question for us is why? Why aren't we always at potential output? In other words, that classical model that potential output is all that matters is obviously not true, right? Or at least there's limitations to that model. So what drives us below potential output? So I want to talk about two causes of recession. And these two causes, we're going to talk about a little bit today and a lot tomorrow. We're going to talk about an aggregate demand-driven recession, or we could call this a Keynesian recession, because this is the kind of recession that Keynes envisioned as the primary type of recession that economies like the US has. And I'm going to make the argument this is the most common. And this kind of recession explains some of our biggest recessions, such as the Great Depression. It explains the 2008 global financial crisis. And it largely explains the COVID recession. Right? And I'm going to talk about all of these briefly. Some of them I'll talk more about than others. For instance, I won't have that much to say about the COVID recession because I think after we get to that point, I think it's going to be, we'll see a lot of comparisons between the COVID recession and previous aggregate demand-driven recessions. We will also talk about the other type of recession, an aggregate supply-driven recession, often known as a supply shock. And in US history, the classic example of this is what happened in the US in the 1970s when we had a series of oil recessions. And so we'll talk about that. These are less common, but in some ways worse. In some ways worse. Okay. Let me just introduce you to the aggregate demand-driven recession. Let's begin to talk about this. And like I said, we'll get into it a little bit. But given that we've covered so much material today, I don't want to really go much over 130. So we'll just kind of begin to talk about this, and then we'll kind of pick up here tomorrow. But let's talk about the aggregate demand-driven recession. You know, one example here would just be kind of a Keynesian animal spirits recession. In other words, there's a reduction in confidence and an increase in fear. People begin to worry about the future. What's going to happen? Are we going into a recession? What happens when people get scared? They tend to stop spending, and firms stop investing. And of these, the one that's the most important is investment. Investment is very sensitive to confidence because, you know, the thing about investment is when you engage in investment, you're not really thinking about today. You're thinking about 5, 10, 15, 20 years in the future, right? Most big investments are not going to have immediate payoffs. They're not going to pay off for many years in the future. And so as a result, you know, when the economy doesn't look as good, firms, you know, that they get scared, right? Quite honestly, they get scared. And so what this tends to do is this tends to reduce aggregate demand. So let's think about our aggregate demand curve. So let's assume here we are in the long run. And we're at our natural rate of output. Okay, everything is very happy. And the other thing here, remember when we're at the natural rate, is that actual inflation is equal to expected inflation. Now, what happens as a result of this fear, right? The loss of confidence that begins to lead people to change their behavior in terms of spending on consumption or investment. Aggregate demand goes down. And what happens when aggregate demand goes down? Prices fall. And as prices fall, we move along our short-run aggregate supply curve to a lower level of output, a level of output that is below the natural rate. So the fall in aggregate demand reduces the price level. We move along the short-run aggregate supply curve to this new spot. And what's true now? We have a recession. And the recession is that output is below the natural rate, right? Output's fallen below the natural rate. Also, though, note something less obvious has happened. What's happened to actual inflation? Actual inflation fell, but expected inflation has not fallen. So we're actually in a situation where actual inflation is lower than expected inflation. and that the actual price level is less than the expected price level, right? Because the actual price level went down, but the expected price level didn't change. Okay? That's what Keynesians think happens during recessions, is that aggregate demand falls oftentimes, not because of anything real has changed, right? Not because of anything real. Sometimes it's just the psychological fear, right? The psychological fear of something unforeseen happening that changes people's behavior. Aggregate demand falls, and as a result, output falls below the natural rate. Now, the next question is, how long does it last? How long does this recession last? How does it end? Well, that is an excellent question. That is an excellent question. And here is where you begin to get really kind of two different views of the world when it comes to how you deal with a recession. One view of the world is that just let the market work itself out. Let the invisible hand work. Let markets figure it out. Okay? Eventually, people are going to catch on that inflation has fallen. Eventually, workers are going to accept wage cuts when they understand what's going on. And these wage cuts will begin to shift short-run aggregate supply. And increase output. And so that recessionary gap will close over time. Okay, so let me draw a graph here of what's going on. I'm going to recreate that graph I drew a couple minutes ago. Where we have this fallen output, or sorry, fallen aggregate demand. So that output fell, the price level fell. And when we get to this new spot, we know, I'm going to put this, that actual inflation is less than expected inflation at this point, right? The blue is our recession. Now, the green is the recovery. How do we recover? Eventually, wages will start to fall. And as wages fall, short-run aggregate supply will shift to the right. So in other words, as people increase their expected price level, I'm sorry, not increase, that decrease their expected price level, short-run aggregate supply curve moves to the right. And output, that gap between output and natural rate of output begins to go back. Right? That's what I mean by the recessionary gap closes. Output fell down here, and now it gradually moves back to the natural rate as wages and expected inflation adjusts. That's kind of nice, right? That's kind of nifty. Do you see any potential downsides to this approach? What's the limit to this approach? Any guesses? What's the limit to this approach? No takers? So this means that everyone's going to have to catch on to what's going on. Everyone's going to have to rework their nominal wage contracts. Everybody's going to have to get their incentives back in order. Everyone who lost a job is going to have to get back in the market to get a job. How quick is that going to take place? Who knows? Is this going to take a month? A year? 2 years? 4 years? I mean, the problem with this approach is how long? How long is this going to take? Classical economists would say, oh, not long. Markets are efficient. Keynesians would argue long. Why? Because markets often have distortions and inefficiencies. Because Keynesians believe that wages don't adjust quickly, that people's expectations don't adjust quickly, that it just takes a long time for these things to work themselves out. So Keynesians look at the world and they see this complicated system by which many, many things have to essentially get in order before the economy starts to work at full output again. And how long will it take those things to work? A long time. Probably the classic expression here of the Keynesian approach is when Keynes was asked, well, won't the economy work itself out in the long run? And Keynes's response was yes. But the problem is in the long run, we're all dead. Right? And what does he mean by this? Well, I think what he means is that, yes, the long run is kind of an interesting, it is a useful theoretical construct to think about the world. But the fact of the matter is we don't live in the long run. We live in the short run. And so why should we give up 2 years, 3 years, 4 years of being below potential output, right? We are giving up a lot of lost output by waiting. And it's not just the output that matters, it's all the other social ills that are created. Because we know that when people lose their jobs and lose their income, they're also much more likely to commit suicide. They're much likely to die from drug overdoses. They're more likely to be divorced. Children are more likely to be raised by single parents, on and on down the line. This has a number of social implications. So Keynesians say we just can't wait. We just can't wait for this thing to work it out. And so option number 2, and this is where we'll pick up tomorrow, is Keynesian stabilization policy. Is to use the tools of government to try to increase aggregate demand and get output back to the natural rate. And so that's the argument that Keynes made in his book, The General Theory, in which he argued that it's the government's role here not to just wait around, not to be those, to remember the joke I told this morning about the classical economists. How many classical economists does it take to change a light bulb? 0, right? When the market conditions are right, the light bulb will change itself. Well, I mean, how long is that going to take, right? It might take a very, very long time. So Keynes would argue, why wait when you can do something about it? You can use the tools of government to try to counteract the tools of recession. What should the government be doing during a recession? It should be trying to stimulate the economy. And so tomorrow we're going to talk about what those tools are, right? How exactly can the US government try to increase aggregate demand, right? What does it look like? Which of these tools tend to be the most effective according to Keynes? And then we're going to talk a lot about specific recessions. So as I said, we're going to talk about the Great Depression, we're going to talk about the 2008 financial crisis, and we'll also talk about another type of recession, the aggregate supply-driven recession, that will maybe make us think a little bit differently about how governments are supposed to respond to recessions. So that's where we're all going to pick up tomorrow morning. And like I said, everything we talk about tomorrow is also in chapter 12. So if you've read through chapter 12, you're that much ahead. And if you haven't read through chapter 12, once again, tonight would be a good night to do that, right? Because this stuff is important enough that you don't want to kind of sit around in confusion for too long, because, getting this down now will help you understand not just a lot of what we talk about tomorrow, but really a lot of what we talk about next week is really predicated on having a good grasp of this aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. Okay, all right. Well, good day's work. Hopefully you are all well and not too exhausted by all this. I will grade your quizzes tonight and I'll hand those back to you tomorrow, all right? So anyway, see you all tomorrow, one place or another. Have a good evening.
Thanks, Todd.
Yeah, thank you, Mitch.
Oh, sorry. I forgot to write my name on the quiz. Would that be a problem, or you want me to?
No, you're fine. I know you sent it to me in email, so I know who you are.
Thank you.
Okay.